Stage. Thank you all for being here. It's good to see that no one has made a dash for the exit. My name is Adrian Davis. I'm the Managing Director of EMEA, as it says up there for ISC Squared. And I'm really pleased to be joined by our panelists, mainly because they can do all the work and I can throw questions at them, and I don't have to think of something to talk about for an hour to entertain you. On my far right and on your left is Justin, who is from Box. I actually haven't met Justin before, although I know of his products and his company's history, so this is a new one for me. Next to Justin is Eran Feigenbaum from Google, and I've known Eran for a number of years. I met him at RSA many, many years ago. He hasn't changed.
I don't know if that's a good thing or bad thing.
We'll discuss that one afterwards, shall we? Or maybe it's a panel question for later. And then next to Eran is Daniele from the Cloud Security Alliance. Daniel and I have again known each other for a number of years, and both ISC Squared and CSA are currently working together on certification and cloud education. And finally, Quentyn Taylor from Canon. I've known Quentyn for many, many years. I think Quentyn and I go back into double figures. So a very good panel, very experienced in the use of cloud and in the regulatory and the governance and the compliance piece around it. So let's start off with questions. And the first question is to you, the audience. Very simple. Please raise your hand if your organization uses the cloud. Okay. For those of you who didn't raise your hand, yes, you are. Just so you know, because someone in marketing will be using it. And that's one of the key things, is that cloud these days is pervasive. We all use it. We all have to deal with it. Before I go to the panel, I have a second question. So we've established that cloud use is almost universal in this audience. How many of you in this audience are responsible for your organization's cloud use, cloud policy, cloud strategy? Raise your hands if you are. A much smaller number. If you are not responsible, are your business managers responsible? Please raise your hand if they are. An even smaller number. Good. So it could be that many of you are actually in a position where you're using the cloud, yet there is no responsibility or authority or governance. So I'm going to pass it over to the panel. You can see the audience reaction there. So the first question is very simple. Who do you think should be accountable for cloud use in the organization? I'm going to start off just really to throw the question to Daniele first. I told them with no order for these questions. Who do you think should be accountable within an organization, and perhaps why?
Quentyn.
Quentyn.
Well, it's actually true, though. It depends, first of all, on accountable for what. So the concept of accountability has been, I guess, studied and defined in many ways. But ultimately, each one of the actor of the cloud supply chain has his own share of responsibilities. If we are looking at from the privacy point of view, which is one of the topic we're going to touch upon today, certainly the cloud customer is going to be accountable of what's going on. So he's going to be the one in charge of definition of roles and responsibility, and having sure that whenever he's having a discussion with Eran as his cloud service provider, is able to understand in which way responsibilities between the cloud service and the cloud service provider are going to be shared, which I guess is going to be is indeed one of the in theory very easy part to solve and address, but then in practice it looks like not everybody is getting this point very right.
So as a provider then, Eran, where's your sort of viewpoint from here?
I like Daniele, and he started to redefine the question, right? What do we count accountable? And I'll define it as drive for the cloud. Mm-hmm. Who should be driving for the cloud? And ultimately, like most things in organizations, doesn't always happen this way, but most things should happen by the business, right? Most things should be there to help generate business. We're all in business to grow revenue. Oftentimes, what we're seeing now with the consumerization of IT is users are necessarily pulling the business into the cloud because they're saying, wow, I can do this at home. How come I can't do this at work? I have this wonderful tool like Box, Dropbox, Google, and how come at home at work I'm still struggling to send an email attachment that's half a gig.
Oh, that's interesting. Just getting back to the audience, how many of you have that same question given to you? Like, why can't I do this at work that I do it at home? Because I get that as well. Okay, sorry, thank you. Yep.
Was I done? No, so I mean, I think, and then another driver, right, I actually starting to see a new trend just in the last several months, more so, a little stronger, is moving to the cloud by the security group. Because they realize that a lot of security can be better in the cloud. A lot of functions can be outsourced in from a security perspective, the cloud, right? Whether it's spam, virus, phishing, et cetera. Whether it's a security vendor or a traditional cloud provider, that's a motivator that I see organizations moving so they can enhance their on-premise capabilities by using the cloud.
Okay. So Quentyn, you were nodding furiously there.
Nodding furiously there because it's not just cloud that you see security groups wanting to push out. Take, for example, bring your own device, choose your own device, and whatever you want to call it. I'm seeing a lot of things where it's the security group pushing for this because they're saying, well, in reality, I can't command the waves to go back, so let's just embrace it. And the same thing's with the cloud. We've pushed in our company into a lot of cloud initiatives from the security team because we realize that in many, many cases, it's faster, better, cheaper, better than to attempt to do it ourselves. And we realize that running this stuff in our own data centers, where you're hiding to nothing because that costs you a lot of money to do that and has a long lead time, so much better to just say, well, hang on a second, so the instant I get my final signature, I can have that up and running the day after. Now, for a lot of security services, that's an awful lot better. And then I gain that sort of that scope. But just to go back to the original question very quickly about who was responsible, well, in reality, it's who is currently responsible. Just because you're moving it to the cloud doesn't change anything. It's just changing the delivery mechanism as far as I'm concerned. It's kind of like old wine in new bottles with a few more risks.
Well, I do think there are a couple of changes. And when we look at, because we're dovetailing into or hitting a couple points on the security value being driven out of cloud, when you look at, say, file storage, I mean, we've been living in a decentralized world ever since we got the mainframe for roughly 20 some odd years, where files have been stored on email attachments, USB sticks, file servers, SharePoint, within the applications themselves. But what we have now is an opportunity to re-centralize that content so we can apply, finally, the theories of security, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, which we could not do in a decentralized world, and being able to do it in a fully extensible model where we can extend our policies, not just within our enterprise, but where the business actually shares out that content to third parties, customers, regulators, auditors, partners, whatever it might be, and drive the security model where that goes. And so it's not just a betterment for security in some senses, but it's a complete shifting or a step level function up of how we've conceived of security and how we implement it. And I think those are just now starting to come out. We've gone through roughly about 10 years or so from the very beginning of quote unquote cloud to actual real adoption, but we've had dramatic maturation cycles within the cloud providers themselves. A lot of them grew up in the consumer world, and then some very niche focus on enterprise, and now that security is a huge conversation in the public and the power of the purse driving that conversation down, a lot of the consumer-oriented companies are now starting to see the value of being security-oriented themselves in a different way, which is also resonating quite as well.
So it's an interesting thing here. We have this, as you rightly say, cloud has completely changed and become something very different from where it originally started. So Daniel mentioned that the customer must be accountable. So you have to know what you're buying and what you want. Well, hopefully you know what you want and what you're buying, but there's also, I think, to come up from your point there, Justin, and maybe Eran as well, as providers, you have an accountability and a responsibility to build security, or at least put security into your operations and into your products and so on.
I would say it goes even well beyond that. The way that we see ourselves and our role within the customers, we're not just a service provider, we're a partner, or more importantly, we're an extension of our customer's environment. And as a result of that, we need to act accordingly. We need to not only provide the implementation of security within the application, but also operationally. How do we respond when a customer has an incident? Do we just go back to SLAs, or do we actually jump in operationally and support them? And we actually go towards the latter. How do we support confidentiality, not just within the application, but also as requests come in? And how do we deal that from a legal standpoint?
Well, I think it's really important to define what type of cloud we're talking about. I think CSA did a great job at putting a slide together showing the different responsibilities and accountability from a customer to a provider on the different types of cloud, right? So from an infrastructure as a service to a software as a service, there's very different responsibilities between the vendor and the customer. I think it's important to understand them so you don't have a breakdown. But obviously in the infrastructure as a service, the provider is responsible for a lot less. You're doing a lot more of the work, the patching, the backing up, et cetera. So you can't hold the provider accountable for that, as opposed to software as a service where really it's your responsibility to basically to manage users and, more importantly, to understand what the provider is giving you before you sign that contract on the bottom and understand they're accountable.
If I can just hop in there, because obviously we talk about things as a service, but to a marketing guy, it's Box, it's Salesforce. He doesn't care what service it is. It's just something he or she uses. So part of this is about educating the users. And if we go back to the business is accountable, the business is driving this, what's the role of people like ourselves, and where does our knowledge, our information security knowledge and abilities, where do we feed those in to help these end users buy the right product and specify the right level of security without getting involved in all the as a service and the technical stuff? Because if the users specify the wrong thing, then all your good efforts are worthless. All our good efforts are worthless. Maybe Daniel or Quentyn can jump in.
Well, I can say that nobody can help a customer that is not able to identify his own requirements. So that was an issue, for in-house project. Is going to be an issue for cloud. Is going to be an issue forever. The time spent by organization in understanding which are their requirements for real, it's always time that they need to. It's an exercise they need to go through necessarily. But once that step is done and you have a very good understanding of your own requirements, then it's very much about posing the right question to your counterpart and being able to compare different providers and being able to use tools so that you can compare apples with apples. You mentioned earlier SLAs. So SLAs is another very good example of a situation in which that's a lot to do to improve the market. Because currently not always SLAs from different providers can be compared, which is obviously an issue.
Yeah.
Now, if we bring it back to the accountability discussion, it is true that ultimately it's the customer that is accountable, is responsible and accountable, but it's also true that there is a certain level of responsibility and accountability for the cloud service provider to be a good steward of the data that the cloud service, the cloud customer is handing over to them. And therefore, it's their responsibility to make sure that customers are able to understand what's in the contract, what is offering the SLA, what actually that SLA means.
Yeah.
And I mean, I fully agree with you there. It's very, very clear to me that it is the customer's responsibility to ensure that they ask for the right things. And cloud providers can make sure that they put the right words in and start hinting at what kind of things they need to ask for. But at the end of the day, that customer has to demand it and has to say, if you're not willing to provide these things that I want, then I will go elsewhere. And I think there's an awful lot of, in the industry, it's very, very easy to sort of like to misblame. But in reality, that customer has to say, I want this, and I'm accountable for this, so please deliver on these promises, else I will go elsewhere. And it's up for customers to vote with their feet to guide it.
I think there's also another part, which is that you have to make the customer aware, because they may not be the information security or the IT guy, they may be the business, the marketing, they have to be aware of their responsibilities and their accountabilities. They're the people signing the checks, they're the people signing the contracts. So if things go wrong, it lands on their desk, not on the information security person's desk, because they blame you for everything. you mentioned there about stewardship of data, which is a lovely segue into privacy, so I'm not going to let it go, I'm sorry. Data Protection Acts, we all know about the European directives, we know about the differences between the American approach, the Chinese approach, the UK approach, etc.
Oh, and by the way, if any of you've got data in Holland, have a quick look for what went through the Dutch Parliament on the 25th. Oh, yeah. They took the more enthusiastic aspects of the European Act and have dropped it straight into Dutch law, and it will become law soon.
Oh, really?
And they're looking at not 2% fines, but 10% of global turnover fines.
Wow.
And by the way, none of this is legal advice, but so that's quite significant. Mandatory data breach reporting, and then a structured fine, a structured fine structure for things like not having a security officer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's going to come in Holland. It just needs to go through one more reading, and then I think it's in place. So that'll be very interesting, the fact that one of the European entities has almost jumped the gun and gone straight for, okay, we want that.
Yes, exactly, and this is where I was going to come into, funny enough. So again, a great segue. We read each other's minds, don't we? When it comes down to information and data, under UK and EU law, the customer, they own the data. They are responsible for the data. So how on earth, and this is a question first of all to the audience, do you believe that the cloud can offer privacy protection better than you can do within your organization? Please raise your hand if you agree with that statement. Not many. You've got some. You've got some. Come on, guys. Got some work to do here. So, from that, and that's one of the biggest concerns that people always talk about is privacy and protection of data in the cloud. How do we overcome this? Is this a job of the intelligent customer, or is it a job of the intelligent service provider, or is it a combination, or is it something different I've missed? Please feel free.
So I'll jump in. The problem that we have in privacy is not an understanding of the law or regulations or the intent. Even though a company might not have or be beholden to a privacy law, they might have privacy policies of their own like. But the problem is really technically. How do you analyze the massive corpus of data that most companies have, the terabytes, petabytes, or possibly even exabytes of data, and to understand contextually whether it falls into the privacy issues of any country? That is the fundamental problem. And we've been very poor as a software industry to implement capabilities within file servers or any other application to provide that context so that a privacy officer or a security officer or general counsel can actually say, how can I properly manage the content within my environment? So within cloud providers, I think that we're beholden to a certain extent, understanding the problems that our customers face and provide the capabilities to give context to that data. Because it's going to be very, very difficult for any company to say, I completely understand the context of all the content that I have on workstations, on email attachments, on this distributed world, because we can't even secure it in a decentralized capability. And so I think it's a shared responsibility where the onus or the accountability might not necessarily be on the cloud provider. I think our responsibility is to be part of that conversation, to derive the solutions, to do the right thing for our customers.
Okay. Expanding on that, I also think it's a combined responsibility, but I think it should be very clear that the data owner of the data that you put in the cloud is the customer. And the cloud provider should be only the data processor and processing it in accordance with the agreement of that customer, of the data owner, right? And only for the purposes of providing the services to that customer. And I think that's where sometimes there might be a confusion in between consumer services versus business services, right? So consumer services are typically monetized by advertisements, right? So they may process the data a little bit differently versus businesses, which are typically paying for services and not necessarily have a more secure requirement, but have a more specific privacy requirement on how that data can be used, who it belongs to, when it needs to be deleted, et cetera, all the things in the Article 29 working group.
I wonder actually if we will see a change in consumer services where we will ask users, if you value your privacy, would you be willing to pay for that consumer service? And to be honest, maybe I'm just different to a lot of people, but I actually would be willing to pay for the service if I have complete guarantees as to what I will get for that service and what will happen with my data and how that will be used. Because we're not talking about a lot of money that you'd need to pay for that particular service. We're talking relatively small amounts of money, micropayments in many cases. And I wonder whether we will see a fundamental change. It's like I was having a conversation with someone, and the person had the mistaken belief that they were the customer. And eventually I said, you do realize if you're not paying for the service, you're not the customer, you're part of the raw material of the product. Someone else is the customer. And I think we need to get a lot of people aware of that, of where's the financials here? Who's paying for this service? Who's monetizing it? Because if you're not paying for it, you are just part of that raw material.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think we're going to see an awareness on the consumer side of security for quite some time. I think it's generational. I mean, we've tried for at least 15 years to drive better security, whether it's financial institutions doing two-factor authentication on devices. eBay had a really huge push many, many years ago, and it never really stuck. And now we're having continuous conversations around that same ilk. But I think it'll happen, but we're talking 10, 15, 20 years for it really to take hold. But now is the very beginning of that conversation. We've never really had security to be part of the mainstream conversation, at least in my career. And now it actually has. And so as we move forward, that breeding in of the DNA, if you will start to ebb down. And I look at my kids and how they're growing up and how they're dealing with technology, being very privacy and security focused, and actually selecting solutions as a result of that, which has never been the case in earlier generations.
I was going to say, I think you're right there, because there is a generational shift now. We are seeing less people going to Facebook, less young people posting stuff on Facebook. They're using different approaches.
It's not just going to Facebook,
but
it's actually
as example,
leveraging the solutions
or
the configurations appropriately, and if they're not there,
they
move
walk away. Yeah,
but
exactly.
I hope it's not only a generational and we have to wait 10 or 15 years.
Me too.
No, but we've taken some steps to try to encourage people to do the right thing, right? Most people want to do the right thing if they understand it. And just for example, on the two-factor authentication, right? eBay rolled it out and didn't get very much of an uptake. And we rolled it out as well. And one of the things we've done to get consumers to encourage them to use two-factor authentication is double their Gmail storage, right? So they get twice as much Gmail storage if they enroll for two-factor authentication rather than the users that just use usernames and passwords. So I think cloud providers can get creative to help users do the right thing.
And I actually think that what you guys did was actually interesting. You made it the first decision. Using mobile phones and SMS messaging for two-factor versus a hidden option in a configuration. You're really bringing it to the forefront of an individual or a consumer and driving them down that path versus being what historically has been done, which has been hidden in the background.
Actually, you caused a very interesting conversation to occur at work on the consumerization side, where one of my users said to me, why is it that my own Gmail account has better security than this other system? And I had to say, actually, yeah, you've got a good point there. Thank you. Actually, that's a good point. So you actually have started to drive that security message where ordinary users are saying, I see the need for this, so I'm going to start to request that wherever I go. And anything that doesn't have this kind of level of security, I perceive as being lesser.
I'm afraid that is an exception, though. I mean, normally...
It's only one conversation I've had, to be honest.
But yeah, for sure, I mean, the whole issue about, discussion about education is going to be compelling, especially if we start looking like in the future and IoT popping in. But going back to the original question, I was kind of surprised to see so many people to say that they believe they can have better privacy yes, sorry.
You misunderstood the point.
All right.
The question is not whether or not all my privacy is better. If I put all my data in one place, if I have a particular piece of information, I can look after that better, say as hard copy, than you could ever look after it in any
Sure.
form. And so far, most importantly, you've not talked about the law, international law, and state actors.
I was coming to that bit, don't worry.
And also it's mixing what users can do in consumer systems as opposed to what companies do. It's not fair. You're muddying the waters, and I think we need to hear about what companies do and how you can help companies. You're being a bit evasive at the moment, guys. It'd be better to hear a little bit, put a bit more meat on it.
Sure. Okay. So what was the real point you will? I mean, because my point was the point I was going to make is that I'm pretty sure that if we are going to ask the same question about security, and someone would ask you, would you think you would find a better security in the cloud than what you can have in premise? I mean, someone would say that cloud providers can offer a better level of security. That it tells me that most likely you can have even a better level of privacy. What is going to be more difficult, though, to your point, is to be compliant to data protection regulation. Now, I'm not sure what the question there was, but more than happy to address it if you can rephrase it in a way I can answer.
It was to Adrian's original question. I thought referred to if I have a particular piece of information, say my personal tax position, if I kept that as hard copy in the filing cabinet, it is more secure than if it was in the cloud.
Sure.
I thought that was the question you asked, and it wasn't the question that was asked.
But it depends upon which cloud. That's the point.
I think, yeah.
Your
Hang on.
personal tax position
Just
will
for
be in the government cloud anyway.
Just for the benefit of the people at the back who may not have heard the gentleman has actually made a very interesting point, which is, are we actually answering or asking the right question? Which is, if I were to take a piece of data, personal tax records was the example given, print them out, lock them away in a fireproof safe, for example, just thinking through my physical security bit, can I compare that, or would the cloud, if I were to store it electronically, would the cloud offer me the same level of protection, the same level of privacy? Can I, one of the questions is, can I compare them? But let's do the first question. Would putting material in the cloud give you the same level of protection from your personal viewpoint as storing your data in a fireproof safe where you knew it was?
So I don't think that's a fair question. So I still have personal information or some files I keep in a safe deposit box in my bank, right? I won't tell you where I bank, but I do. And it's not because I don't trust the cloud. It's because that information, one, I don't need to access on a regular basis, right? So if I need to access it, it's a pain in the butt. I need to go to the bank, I need to show my ID, I need to pull out the key, I need to get the banker to pull their key, we need to walk into the safe. Sometimes there's a queue, right? So as opposed to going online, authenticating, and getting my information. So I think to evaluate both options, the question is the data safer on a server that's sitting underneath my desk, whether at home or at business, that I connect to, or the cloud provider, right? That's a more fair evaluation.
And to refer to what the gentleman was saying about state actors, just to take that example, if a state actor was particularly interested in that piece of paper that you had in your safety deposit box, whether it's in the cloud or it's in the safety deposit box, they can walk in, get the same key under regulatory statutes, and just ask the bank teller to open it up with you not being there and get access to it. So
Or
whether
they
or
can
not
get a
it's
bunch
more or
of-
less protected, there's
yeah.
very little difference.
I can get a bunch of 70-year-old criminals to drill a big hole in the wall
Exactly, yes.
and just take it out anyway. Sorry.
Even without permission, I mean, if we want to still discuss about state actors, I mean, I'm sure that many of you have been reading the news lately about what's going on in Germany, right? So we had this huge campaign a few months back. Everybody was like, wow, they've been tapping on Angela mobile phone. Then it happened to come up that the German secret services, in collaboration with Deutsche Telekom, they've been voluntarily giving access to NSA to mount whatever technology they would like to have to make tapping into the German system. So if we want to bring the discussion to state actors, I think we are going to enter in a discussion where everybody is going to feel very doomed for his future because nobody has any protection and any level of privacy. So if we start from that assumption and we are very realistic about it, then we can stop this conversation. But if we believe that there are still some rules that can apply, even though we need to be a bit naive to imagine that if a state actor wants to have access to my data, it's not going to have it unless he has a permission, then we can follow this conversation. I mean, because again, it's whatever piece of information has some value, and a very and a state actor wants to have access to that information, he will or she will, no matter what you do, no matter if you believe it's illegal or it's legal, they will do it.
But I think there is an interesting point. Sorry, there's an interesting point that comes out of this. Sorry. It is very difficult actually to compare the security of different types of, paper versus server versus cloud, because we don't have a way of measuring those on a good linear or Likert scale. So it's very tough. And I think sometimes we do get ourselves tied up in knots because we look at one thing and say that's perfect, but it's perfect only in a particular situation, and there may be another situation where it is not so perfect. It is a tough one. It's a good question, and we will keep going because I'm going to let Justin have his say,
Sure.
and I want to talk about international laws.
Yep.
So don't worry. It was on my list of questions to ask.
Fantastic. So I think you can compare the two. I think that it'll be more secure because when we start talking about security versus privacy, privacy mostly is wrapped around confidentiality of who should access that piece of content and is it appropriate. So using the safe metaphor, actually, before I say that, you have an opportunity to actually have better security. Then it really depends upon the cloud provider providing that security, which is a very different conversation unto itself. But if you look at a typical safe with, let's say it's a 6-pin code, there's no identity. You're actually using location of that content as a proxy for identity validation. There's no logging, there's no alerting, there's no preventative back enforcement of failure of authentication to that. So is your safe going to lock out after 6 attempts? So those types of capabilities that we've embedded within the basic fabric of how we deal with information security are not mechanisms that you typically see in safes. Maybe you can get a 2-factor safe with a biometric on it, so fair enough. Maybe you can get something that actually has preventative capabilities, such as locking itself out. But those are very, very rare and very not common to the typical individual with safes. Again, I think there's a lot more capabilities that we have within a software stack to provide confidentiality, to provide forced security on the back end. But security and privacy are tangential, but they're not necessarily the same conversation. So I did want to call that out.
To move on to the next point, with the international law, because we have, I have a friend who's a CISO who basically wakes up every morning and she has to decide which country's law she's going to break. How do we deal with this mishmash of international law? You may be an intelligent customer, so we're going to assume you are. You're buying a particular service to service a particular nation or region or whatever it may be. How do you overcome this challenge of meeting your compliance obligations, including, but not limited to, the privacy thing? How do you do it? What are the questions you need to ask? What are the questions you as providers want to hear?
So I think international laws are very complicated, right? And they're sometimes conflicting, right? Some laws may say store data for 90 days, other may say delete it within 60 days, right? So I think as a provider, at least our opinion is the customer, don't want to pretend that we understand the customer's regulatory compliance requirements. We do understand our capabilities and how our services work. So we're glad to answer compliance, and ultimately compliance is the customer's responsibility. So glad to answer any details, and I think every cloud provider should be willing to answer those details that you need to make to come up with that assessment whether that service will meet your requirements or not. But to try to pretend and say that we meet all international requirements is, I think any provider that's saying that is not being forthcoming. Obviously, some of the major ones, right, are a little easier to meet. The EU data regulation, FISMA, ISO. Well, those aren't necessarily regulatory compliance, but more standards.
Okay.
So yes, I mean, the one thing that I would break it down from a provider standpoint is really understand what markets you want to play in and making sure that the capabilities within the software stack, the compliance features that you're providing, whether it's authentication, cryptography, or any other mechanism control that you're putting in place, is effectively there. I mean, to the point earlier, where if there is all markets and all locations around the world, it might not necessarily be a focus for that cloud provider, and as a result, those capabilities aren't implemented in the service. So it really depends upon the cloud provider, what their focus is, what market is it, is it consumer or enterprise, is it a vertical, such as financial services versus others? So it can depend on what their focus is, which results in differential services and capabilities that they provide to their customers.
I think it comes down to you have to know what you want, and you have to be aware of the laws you are trading under and the jurisdictions you may be legally operating in. And only from then can you actually start to have that intelligent conversation.
As well as will operate in. So as a company grows, they go into other geographic jurisdictions, and they need to make sure that their cloud provider is able to go with them down that journey.
And also as a provider, you kind of hope that your provider is not setting out to break the law, that your provider is setting out to be a good provider and stick to the principles of what they should be doing. And if they stick to honest principles, then in reality, they should be at least halfway there in meeting the regulatory requirements.
So this kind of again comes back to you have to know what you want. You have to be able to look across the providers you want to use. Come back to your thing about SLAs and everything else. What has the provider delivered before? How have they done things in practice? What is their track record?
Because you see, I mean, that is also bringing a lot of, a better level of maturity and in the provider's offer, because we have seen, I mean, in the past few years, a number of organizations complaining that they wouldn't be able to move data outside a certain specific geographic location. So let's say UK or Germany. And that has been when cloud service provider, having realized some limitations, so beside the dream of having a cloud computing that is global, where you can store your data wherever you like, simply this is not going to happen. I mean, at least this is not going to happen in Europe until we have the policymaker we have nowadays. So we've seen cloud service provider being forced to open more data center in locations where they couldn't they couldn't avoid to have a data center, which is fair enough.
To be honest though, again, this isn't legal advice, but with the exception of certain kinds of data in Switzerland, but certain kinds of data, for the vast majority of data, there is no real legislation that I've seen that demands the data is in country A or in country B. There's a lot of perceptions from the customer, and so from that perspective, you end up ceding to the wishes because they are, eventually the customer is always right, and if they say they want it in that country, well then put it in that country. But apart from, say, for example, Swiss and banking data and some other kinds of data, there's very, and governmental data.
French audit data.
Yeah, there's not many audit data types that have to be held in country. They can be held, well, yes, I said there aren't. Sometimes the healthcare data, some kinds of government data, but for the general data, there's no real requirements to put it specifically in country. Yeah. Although there's a lot of customers who have a perception of that.
Oh, yes, thank you. The lady with the microphone's coming your way, so you'll be able to heard. Thank you.
My understanding of the Data Protection Act is that personal data in the EU must be stored within the EU, and customers must be notified if their data is actually stored elsewhere. So I would have thought that is one piece of legislation which does actually determine where you can store data.
Well, actually, no, because what it states there is you must tell your customers up front. So long as up front you're telling your customers that this data will be stored in country A, B, or C, and remember, it's not where the data is stored, it's also where the data is accessed from, because I've had it where people say, well, my data is stored in EU, but then the help desk or the people accessing that data are in a country outside of the EU. So as long as you're open and honest about where the data is being accessed from and where it's being stored, you are generally okay.
To take another example, say the Patriot Act in the US, where government can access data owned by US organizations or actually stored on US soil. That's another piece of legislation which does impact where one would actually store data.
I don't think it's just on US soil, because Microsoft is currently fighting that with
In
data
Ireland.
in Dublin.
Yes, in Ireland they
I mean,
are.
No, it's more a question of the legislation determining where one should consider storing data.
I think every country pretty much has their own equivalent of the Patriot Act, right? I mean, I heard the news about the new one coming in the UK today. Now, as well, I mean, just by a show of hands, who thinks data location gives you better security?
Very few.
Very few, yeah. I'll tell you, attackers and adversaries don't abide by geographic lines.
No.
Right? They don't say, oh, the data's in the UK, I can't hack it. And back to the EU regulations, right? Not only does it allow you to list, but it also allows you by entering into model contract clauses to store the data outside of the EU as well.
No, I actually think on Friday the Patriot Act actually did not get passed again.
Correct, because the NSA hasn't been monitoring phone calls today, so I've had a great day.
Yeah, it was last night it expired.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. So, there are, the question was actually very well timed, because there is a real issue here about how do you, as an organization, a consumer, customer, or a provider abide. And to be honest, I don't think there is a very simple answer. As an organization who uses the cloud, maybe use the cloud to service your customers or store their data, all you can do is make sure that you have done your best. This is not legal advice. Check the ICO website for a start. But be upfront and say, we use the cloud, we will store your data in this location. Inform your customers and let them make a choice. That is one of the things you can do. These guys as providers, they will build data centers all around the world, but at the end of the day, they can build a data center in Europe, in Ireland, to service Europe, and then someone can change the law on you, and then you're back to square one.
Or the data path can
Or the
go.
data path.
I don't know if
Exactly.
everybody here remembers when there was a slight problem with one of the Nordic cables from Norway over to the US had a problem, and at the same time there was another problem on one of the other Atlantic cables. So all of our data started going around the world backwards for about 2 hours. Now, interestingly, I don't know which jurisdiction, suddenly all of our data in Europe going to the US suddenly went through when it went around the world backwards. Users noticed because their ping times went up dramatically, and everything else changed like that. But that, for example, you can't guarantee which jurisdictions your data is going to need to go through to get from place A to place B. That's the wonderful world of the internet.
Exactly, and email is a best effort, best route, so it goes everywhere.
Well, I'm
but
sure
nowhere.
everyone here has heard of attacks where suddenly overnight people start going, hey, hang on a second, who started advertising all those routes over there? Why were we suddenly routing all of our data traffic that way round last night for 3 hours? And these things happen.
So, with any technical solution, there will always be imperfections because of the context in which it works. I think that's the real issue we have with the privacy thing, is there's so many different rules and regulations that you may not be able to build a solution that actually can satisfy them all. And you may not be able to build a solution that satisfies every customer demand for privacy or protection, whatever it may be. We've got about 15, 20 minutes left, so I want to move on to the final one, and it's actually does again dovetail into privacy and everything else, is trust. I get the feeling we have an audience who use the cloud a lot and are pretty skeptical about some of its features maybe. So how can we engender trust? How can we get our customers, obviously now there's two customers here, there's enterprise customers who are buying cloud solutions who want to trust the cloud provider, and there's customers who buy from enterprises who use the cloud. Yes, that's right, that is the right set of words. Just checking, I know it's been a long day. How can we show customers that they can trust the cloud and they can trust organizations with information that is then stored in the cloud?
So I jumping in here as a
Go
chief
for it.
trust officer, so that'd be a little bit relevant. I think the first thing is really transparency. And that's very, very important. I mean, we talked a little bit about it here. There's one thing to say we do what we say and we can prove it. It's that I prove it consistently over time that really establishes a trust relationship between two parties. And so when we start a conversation with potential customers and coming in and they have a lot of questions, not just what is your compliance landscape that have you passed, ISO and everything else, or do you encrypt the things that you do, but hey, I want to walk through your penetration test results. Or maybe we want to do our own penetration test. Or I want to sit and do a walkthrough of your architecture ad nauseum. That's what we do. And we really believe that we're an extension of their environment, so these actions just feel natural to us because we understand the security position that a lot of our customers are in. So one is that our ability to act and behave transparently. The second one is, how do we really understand the problems of our customers, the security problems of our customers, so that we implement either the partnerships or the capabilities more than likely before they ever ask. And if we're able to do that, we're able to have those transparent conversations, not as, hey, that would be really interesting, we should think about that, but 90, 95, 98% of the things that you're asking for, we've already done, and have you thought about these other 10 things? Mm-hmm. And so that's a very different conversation to have than what might occur in other situations.
As an enterprise customer, I can fully back that up. There are two different classes of cloud provider that I tend to deal with. There are ones when you talk to them about their security, and they say, hey, why don't we sit down and have an open and honest conversation? I don't want to talk about names, but there are some out there who are the larger ones, and they're really, really great. You talk to them, and they'll sit down, and they'll even send their senior people to have a teleconference to talk about what they do, why they do it. They'll admit their mistakes and say where they're strong. And you can have a really open and honest conversation. And then there'll be other cloud providers who will say, your security statement, oh, here's the link on our website. I'd like more than that. Do you? Well, you can go somewhere else if you want to. And I've had that conversation with a certain large cloud provider, and eventually I say, well, I don't really like this security measures they've got in place here, but at the end of the day, that's only one measure in the whole grand scheme of things. And unless I can point to an actual material thing where I can say that's wrong, then really it's a negative point, but it's a certain number of points inside the procurement matrix. And so I think some cloud providers really need to step up to the plate, and I think that sometimes when they're very, very, very large, it's not just going to be a case of, but it wasn't Google, we are this big company and so therefore just take us at will and we'll never tell you anything more for security reasons. Other large customers, cloud providers will come in and say, well, we will give you that granular information, and they're the ones I think which are going to actually survive. And what I do say is, when you do find one that does that, then embrace them and help them out and be nice to them, because they're the ones who are doing the right thing.
Well, I can say that, as a CSA, we started, looking at, how we could improve trust in the cloud market a long time ago. That has been, one of the reasons why we have created a registry. So we got on our website, and it's open for everybody to consult. We got a registry where we got published the result of due diligence assessment that most of the cloud providers, we got over 100 of them that are listed there. I've replied to the set of security questions for everybody to consult. Now, the other keyword I would, attach to the trust word is assurance. So the question to me is really, can I trust my cloud service provider to deliver the right level of assurance? So the first example I was giving is very much a sort of, a self-certification, if you like, and it is good enough for someone that needs a limited level of assurance. The higher level of assurance you need, the more towards an evidence-based type of trust you will need to move on. And then we got examples of, of certification that are very good for the purpose. And we have one, for example, in collaboration with BSI and other players there. But then again, it's always a matter of, what you really need. I mean, it's a certification good enough for a third-party audit, good enough to prove that a certain cloud service provider is actually executing on security properties you need to put in place. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. That's why I guess it's our duty, as we were discussing in the beginning about education, and we were discussing earlier about how important it is for a cloud customer to push in order to make sure that it's going to get their question answered and their requirements put in place. So it's their duty to move, to start asking for more, to start asking for something that is not anymore a static assessment of the situation, but more towards a continuous monitoring type of approach. But again, this is something that I'm sure Google is not going to put in place unless they receive a lot of customer questions and requests to do so.
I think trust, more than security or privacy, trust is an emotion. I mean, we trust certain people in our lives, and there's certain people we don't, and we don't have exactly why we can put the finger on it, right? Past history, obviously, and visibility, transparency are big things. And I think a big area for that is around when something goes wrong. Right? Admitting that something went wrong to that customer, why it went wrong, what you did to correct it. I think too often times we're in denial and don't want to admit we made a mistake, right? As individuals, as companies. But to build that trust, it's essential that you do. And make sure, and I think that's not what defines a good security team or a good organization, is admitting those mistakes and learning and moving forward beyond that, right? Rather than trying to cover it up and admit it didn't happen.
We have a question from the audience.
Hi. On that last point, could I just ask about the role of accreditations or accrediting a cloud service? I was thinking of, say, 27018.
Yes.
So something you could perhaps lose if you didn't behave yourself. How that might fit in.
address that question? So accreditation, I mean, you mean a certification scheme that has a proper recognition, right?
Yeah, that sits with a third party like the BSI. That, it's
That's what we do.
accreditation you could lose if you don't behave yourself.
Well, that would happen. So let's put it back. So if you look at certification like ISO 27001 and our STAR certification that mirrors ISO 27001, which is something, as I said, we do with BSI, you are in the position that you don't lose anything if you have a security breach, because a certification like ISO 27001 is certifying a process.
Yes.
It's not telling you that the system is 100% secure. Therefore, if you have a security breach, that security breach is it's an accident that can happen. Everybody can do mistakes, right? So you're not going to lose your accreditation unless in the next visit that the auditor is going to pay you is going to find non-conformities. And that would be the only single reason why you're not going to get your certificate renewed. Back to you've been mentioning ISO 27018. And soon there's going to be another one, which is the 17, which is a couple of security standards that are mainly dedicated to cloud produced by ISO. Now, take into account that none of them is going to be a certifiable standard. They are code of practice. That means that you're not going to be able to get an ISO 27018 certification.
I think one of the problems, though, of course, is with the cloud, because the cloud is a dynamic environment. If you audit or go in and do an assessment for a certificate, it's a static thing. It's what you see on that day. And one of the challenges I think we all, certainly I've come across, is how do you monitor your cloud, your dynamic cloud, the security of a dynamic thing every day? And how do you act on it? And then how do you deal with the volume of information to let you know that your cloud is doing what you want it to do? So certification is a great idea. I think I actually have helped draft 17 and 18, and I'm also doing another one about cloud as well with ISO. It's a great idea, but it's only a static thing. What we need, and this is a big problem, and if anyone solves it, I think they could get very rich. Copyright me, by the way, that is dynamic monitoring and dynamic transparency, if you like, so you can look in and see what's going on and deal with it, both as a customer as a provider.
We are actually...
Hang on, Daniel. Sorry.
Well, one of the fundamental problems that we have in the cloud industry is the dearth of cloud providers behaving as a platform. And what I mean by that, the ability to provide an open RESTful API so a customer can query, not only receive logs on or events on any of their activities on their content or transactions, but also do active or continuous assessment over the configuration, the authorization levels, the identities that have access, et cetera. And that's one of the things that we love to have that conversation with. But we're starting to see other cloud providers going down that path. But until we do, we won't be able to truly enact a continuous assessment model.
And also having auditors who can do that as well.
Well, I don't think you can do it. I think the threat response team that companies have today demand a continuous assessment model built into their threat response. Did that cloud provider get compromised? Did they move from TLS to nothing? Did their data center move? Did they all of a sudden have a configuration shift so that they can make a day-to-day risk management model decision on should we use them anymore? Should we respond and contact that cloud provider for remediation?
Sorry, Daniel.
No, I was saying that we are hoping to release the solution for which you wanted to become rich towards the end of this year. And we are not going to become rich because it's going to be, the specifications are going to be freely available to everybody. And the way we're working on it is, very much linked to the idea of having a good way to define SLAs I was mentioning earlier. And everything starts from how you build proper metrics that can be then compared, and how to associate SLA to metrics. The only point I'm not necessarily in agreement with you is that we shouldn't be selling the idea that you need continuous monitoring for everything. So in security, we know very well that there are a number of parameters that would deserve a checking with a time window that is minutes, if not seconds. But there are a number of other parameters which are actually can be checked every month. So it's very much about defining, what's the right time interval in between the checks and how you can enforce that protocol.
And I think the first major one that did the continuous monitoring requirement was in the U.S. government, the FISMA and FedRAMP, right? Had very specific, maybe not to the extent that Justin mentioned, right? That's great, a standard to achieve to, but at least around specific security events, vulnerabilities, et cetera, that you did have to report each one within a specific time frame.
Are you saying I'm aspirational?
No, we are as an industry.
As much as I like you, Eran, I must say that is very much, well, they like to call it continuous monitoring, as, for example, PCI DSS likes to call it continuous monitoring.
Yeah.
But what it is, in fact, is a, is a
It's
scanning.
point
It's a
in
scanning
time,
that is
yeah.
happening every 3 months. So it's.
To be honest, though, taking a different track on trust, trust is visceral. It's, do I actually trust that organization to do what I want them to be able to do? Doesn't mean to say I have to like what they're doing. I just have to understand or believe that there is consistency of action.
Well, we would like you to like.
Well, yes, I mean, I would also like them, but in
I
reality...
trust you're a bad person.
Yes, I can trust an organisation that I don't particularly like, and that's
Yeah.
perfectly acceptable. And I think it's about getting to that point where, do I actually trust that they're going to do the thing that I want them to do in the way that I want them to do it?
Yeah.
And I think that's the bit that we're missing there. A lot of the conversation here was about monitoring, about the technical bits, but it's more about the bigger picture of, do I actually trust that organisation?
The vast majority of conversations between customers and providers, regardless of what it is, there's typically a very finite list of expectations set, but there's a huge amount of unspoken or contracts that are between two parties that are not spoken, or what you talk about as the unspoken contract.
Yeah. It's where cloud comes to being an issue, which is you have a situation where you say, well, I trust that cloud provider. And then you think, well, actually, do I? Because do I know all the people who are beneath them on their chain? I mean, we internally, we started working out which cloud providers we used, and we divided them into primary, secondary, and tertiary cloud providers. Whereas a primary cloud provider owns the space under their data center. They own everything, the whole stack. Secondary, tertiary, and then we ended up in quaternary, and then I think we stopped at that point because we started going into too much detail. But then we started to say, everybody past a primary provider of cloud, even a secondary provider of cloud, can we trust them? Because do we even know who's in their value chain? I'm sure everyone saw the situation where there was I think it was a Microsoft outage in Dublin where there was a lightning strike a few years ago. And then you suddenly saw all of these weird and wonderful services going offline because they were all somehow backed off to that data center. And then we talked about trust. You think, well, how can you actually trust all of these providers when they're not actually providing their entire stack?
Or you weren't aware.
Or you weren't aware they were providing their own stack.
I mean, so I agree with you. I mean, I think that the sub-processor question is important, but this isn't something new to cloud, right?
No.
I mean, this is
No, of
something
course not.
But it's something that's become very, very visible in cloud.
Yeah.
Because the subcontracting and is much, much bigger. I go and get I get like an infrastructure as a service provider. I then road my platforms as a service provider. I then become a SAS provider, and I may not even know who the first one is anymore.
Not to mention that is very relevant in the context of the European data protection privacy regulation, right?
Yes.
Because under that piece, in theory, you are forced to declare all your the actors of your supply chain.
Yes, you are. Right, we now have a couple of minutes, so I'm going to ask each of the panelists to come up with sort of their one big thought about the headline above their heads, which is solving the cloud conundrum. So I'm not going to pick anybody in particular, but I think I'll start off with Eran.
Not planning to be put on the spot, but I mean, I think the overall headline would be cloud computing can be as secure, if not more secure, than what most organizations are doing today, right? I don't want to, there's lots of very competent organizations that are not using the cloud. But cloud has some of the economies of scale, both from a technology perspective, from a resourcing perspective, and they may be very secure, those organizations. But as a whole, and this isn't just for small and medium business, even large businesses are enjoying some of the security and trust benefits from the cloud. So I think, again, to summarize, it would be cloud computing can be as secure as what you're doing today. And I think if you don't move to the cloud, your competitors are, and they're enjoying some of these economies of scale.
Exactly. Gosh. Oh, that must be time up. Daniele.
Well, the headline would be, do your homework, ask the right questions, and then build your trust on evidences.
Excellent. Justin.
I would say the power of the purse helps unlock the security value of cloud services.
Super. And Quentyn.
The word cloud is going to disappear very soon because it'll just become the way we do things. And whilst we might be focusing on the security piece here, think of it in terms of all of the aspects, and it's going to be swings and roundabouts. Some areas you'll win, some areas you won't win, but overall you have to get a benefit from it for it to be successful.
Yeah. And if I can just add my summary, because I've been writing some notes down, I think this is still a maturing area. We're still coming to grips with this whole thing. Quentyn is right. The cloud will disappear. It will be what we do. It's just stuff, if you like. But I think the key thing is we have to be the intelligent customer. We have to demand what we want from cloud customers, cloud suppliers, and make sure the business understands their legal and compliance regulations. It's a tough job, but if we get our businesses better informed, then I think we will see these problems go away, because they will be selecting the right services with the right requirements, and hopefully then delivering what you need. Thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you very much to the audience as well. Thank you. Safe journeys home. Thank you again. Good night.